A Shadowed Pages welcome to you all from Shadowed Pages. I'm Edward, your host for tonight, and I'm so glad you've joined me. Tell me, where are you tuning in from, and how's your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now, let's begin the mystery. The body among the roses. Dawn arrived slowly in St. Mary. With that chilly January morning, creeping across frost-stiffened lawns, casting shadows of the village chimneys against a sky the color of pearl. Miss Jane Marple, who had weathered over 70 winters in her cottage on the high street, knew that rising early wasn't a virtue. It was simply the result of age and a mind that refused to sleep past 6, no matter the season. She tied the sash of her quilted dressing gown more tightly and gazed out her bedroom window at the garden below. The winter roses were still blooming, resilient specimens her late father had planted decades ago. She had intended to cut a few for the drawing room, but the frost would soon claim them. Best to enjoy them indoors while she still could. Descending the narrow staircase carefully, Miss Marple gathered her gardening basket and secateurs from the scullery, then stepped out through the kitchen door into the cold morning air. The grass crunched underfoot as she walked. She should have worn proper shoes, but the roses were only a few yards away, beyond the lilac bush and a small stone bird bath where robins liked to drink. She walked slowly, inhaling the sharp, clean air. There was something oddly peaceful about a garden at dawn, before the village stirred, before errands and visits filled the day. Miss Marple had always believed that gardens revealed much about their gardeners. Her own, she hoped, reflected a woman who valued order without rigidity, beauty without ostentation. This thought made what happened next all the more jarring. As she took perhaps 10 steps toward the rose bed, she stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her chest. For a moment, she thought she might faint. A sensation she hadn't felt since the summer of 1898 during an unbearably hot church fete. A man lay among her roses, stretched out on his back, his arms at his sides, his face turned slightly toward the sky. He wore a well-cut dark suit, a rumpled white shirt, and black leather shoes that gleamed even in the dim light. His eyes were closed. He was quite obviously dead. Miss Marple stood motionless, her basket hanging from one arm, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Shock, she knew, could make one act foolishly if one gave in to it. She had seen death before, though she devoutly hoped it would be her last in such an unexpected place. After a moment, she stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything. The police would need to see everything exactly as it was. The man appeared to be in his mid-40s, with dark hair turning gray at the temples. His face, though possibly handsome in life, now held the peculiar, waxen quality of death. His hands lay open, palms up, and Miss Marple immediately noticed they were smooth, uncalloused, the hands of someone who did not work with their hands outdoors. She glanced down at the roses. They were thriving, thick-stemmed with thorny branches and deep crimson blooms. The strange thing, the thing that made Miss Marple's eyes narrow and her mind begin to clear with the peculiar clarity that always came in such moments, was that the roses were untouched. Not a single stem was broken, not one bloom crushed. The earth around the body showed no signs of disturbance, no scuffed soil, no uprooted roots. The man lay neatly among the roses, as if placed there with great care, like a figure arranged in a formal garden display. Miss Marple stepped back, her gaze scanning the rest of the garden. No signs of struggle, no marks of a struggle. The gravel path leading from the side gate to the kitchen door was undisturbed, and the wooden bench near the hedge sat where it always had, though Miss Marple now noticed something dark draped across it. A coat. She did not approach the bench, as that too would be for the police to examine. Instead, she quickly walked back to the house, her mind already working through what needed to be done. The constable must be called at once. Dr. Haddock would need to be contacted, and someone would have to identify the body. though Miss Marple herself had never seen the man before in her life. This was, perhaps, the most curious thing of all. Miss Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead her entire life. She knew nearly everyone in the village and a great many people in the surrounding countryside. She made it her business to know people, much like keeping track of her knitting stitches so the pattern wouldn't fall apart. But this man was a complete stranger. She reached the kitchen and, with only a slight tremor in her hand, picked up the telephone. The exchange operator, a young woman named Gladys, answered at once. "Police, please," Miss Marple said crisply. "It's urgent." Within 15 minutes, Constable Polk arrived on his bicycle, his round face flushed from the cold and exertion. He's a reliable fellow, steady though not particularly imaginative, Miss Marple thought as he stood in her kitchen now, helmet in hand, looking thoroughly uncomfortable. "If you'd come this way," Miss Marple said gently, guiding him through the kitchen door. She pointed toward the rose bed. Constable Polk stared at the body, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then, admirably, he regained his composure. "You didn't touch anything?" he asked. "Certainly not," Miss Marple replied. "And you don't know who he is?" "I've never seen him before," she said simply. Constable Polk began circling the body at a respectful distance, examining it slowly. Miss Marple followed, her eyes not on the body, but on the constable's reactions. Polk, a local man born and raised in St. Mary Mead, didn't recognize the man either, which confirmed that the stranger was, indeed, a mystery. "Dead some hours, I'd say," Polk muttered, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "Cold as anything. I'd best call Inspector Slack from Much Benham." "I think, Constable," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Inspector Crayock might be more appropriate. This is, I believe, not a simple matter." Polk looked at her sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What makes you say that, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple gestured toward the roses. "He did not die here, Constable. Look at the plants. Not a single stem broken. The ground is undisturbed. A man in the throes of death, or even a man being murdered, would surely disturb the plants. There would be broken stems, crushed blooms, signs of struggle. But there are none. He was laid here with great care after death, in a way that seems deliberate." Polk's eyes widened in realization. "Placed, but that would mean murder." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, Constable, I think it does." The constable swallowed hard. "I'll telephone at once." As Constable Polk hurried back toward the house, Miss Marple stood by the rose bed, her eyes scanning every detail. A body had been brought to her garden in the middle of the night. Not to just any garden in St. Mary Mead, but specifically hers. That could not be a coincidence. She thought of her gate, which she kept oiled so it wouldn't squeak and disturb her sleep. She thought of the faint sound she had heard around midnight, a soft click that had barely registered in her drowsy mind. And she thought of the faint scent that had drifted through her open bedroom window in the night. Cologne, a man's cologne. Something faintly expensive and entirely out of place in St. Mary Mead. Someone had been in her garden, someone who knew she would find the body. Someone who, for reasons she could not yet fathom, had chosen her roses as a final resting place for a murdered man. Miss Marple looked down at the body again, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail. A familiar tightening in her chest made her resolve firm. She would get to the bottom of this mystery, no matter how complicated or dangerous it might become. Within a short while, Inspector Dermot Crayock arrived from Much Benham, bringing with him a police surgeon and a photographer whose hands shook slightly as he set up his equipment near the rose bed. Miss Marple, now changed into a sensible woolen dress and cardigan, provided tea in the drawing room while the professionals worked in the garden. "I'm sorry to trouble you again, Miss Marple," Inspector Crayock said, accepting his cup with a slight smile. He was a man in his late 30s with sharp eyes, someone who had learned through experience to take Miss Marple's observations seriously. Though I confess, I'm not entirely surprised to find you involved in yet another mysterious death. I am not involved, Inspector, Miss Marple replied mildly, her voice calm. The involvement, if one might call it that, was thrust upon me. I merely went out to cut roses. Quite so, Crayock said, making a note. Constable Polk tells me you believe the body was placed here after death. I am certain of it, Miss Marple replied, setting down her teacup with a gentle click. The roses tell the story clearly enough. A man in the throes of death, or even a man being murdered, would surely disturb the plants. There would be broken stems, crushed blooms, signs of struggle, but there are none. He was placed here with extraordinary care. Crayock paused, considering her words. Did you hear anything unusual during the night? Miss Marple set down her cup and nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that. I retired at my usual time, shortly after 10 o'clock. My bedroom window faces the garden, and I always sleep with it open a few inches, even in winter. Fresh air is so important, I find. At some point, I heard my garden gate. The latch made a small sound. A click. What time was this? Crayock asked, his pen poised over his notebook. I cannot be certain. I'd been drowsing, and one loses track of time in such a state, but I believe it was around midnight, perhaps a little after. Crayock made a note. And you didn't investigate? Miss Marple smiled slightly. I thought perhaps it was a cat or the wind. The gate is well oiled and does not normally make noise, but it does have a latch that clicks when it closes. I suppose I should have been more concerned, but at my age, Inspector, one becomes rather philosophical about small noises in the night. If I investigated every sound, I should never sleep at all. Crayock smiled at that. Quite understandable. Anything else? Miss Marple hesitated before replying. It was only the faintest of impressions, the sort of thing that might seem foolish when spoken aloud. But I've learned that in matters of murder, the smallest details often matter most. She paused, then added, There was a scent. Crayock looked up. A scent? A man's cologne, she said slowly. Not a scent I recognized, and certainly not one that belongs in St. Mary Mead. Our gentlemen here tend toward plain soap or the occasional bay rum, but this was different, more sophisticated. London, I should think. Crayock's eyebrows rose. You could smell cologne from your bedroom? The window was open and the night was still, Miss Marple replied. Sound and scent carry quite clearly in such conditions. It was only a trace, but I noticed it. It reminded me of young Mr. Fletcher, who used to visit his aunt in the village before the war. He worked in Mayfair at a gentleman's outfitter's and always wore the most expensive cologne. The other young men used to tease him about it rather mercilessly. Crayock chuckled slightly. And you remember this after how many years? Scent is a powerful trigger for memory, Inspector, Miss Marple said, but I mention it only because it struck me as odd. Someone was in my garden last night who had no business being there. Someone who wore expensive cologne. Before Crayock could respond, Constable Polk appeared at the drawing room door, looking excited and slightly nervous. Begging your pardon, Inspector, but there's a Mrs. Merton from number 12 asking to speak with you. Says she saw something last night that might be important. Mrs. Merton proved to be a thin, anxious woman in her 50s who lived 3 houses down from Miss Marple. She perched nervously on the edge of an armchair, twisting her handkerchief between her fingers, and spoke mostly to the inspector, casting occasional nervous glances at Miss Marple. I don't like to intrude, she began, her voice hesitant. But Constable Polk said there's been a death, and I thought I ought to mention what I saw, though I'm sure it's nothing really. Just a coincidence. Please, Mrs. Merton, Crayock said gently. What did you see? Well, I have trouble sleeping, you see. My nerves. The doctor's given me tablets, but I don't like to take them every night. So last night I was lying awake and got up around 11 to make myself some warm milk." She paused, her eyes darting around nervously. "My kitchen window overlooks the lane that runs behind the gardens, including Miss Marple's." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Her curiosity piqued. "Go on," she encouraged. "I saw a figure. A man, I think, though it was very dark," Mrs. Merton continued, her voice growing more agitated. "He was walking along the lane, and he seemed to be carrying something, a bundle of some sort, quite large and heavy from the way he moved. He stopped near Miss Marple's side gate." The room fell silent. Inspector Crayock leaned forward, intent on every word. "What time was this exactly?" Mrs. Merton hesitated, then nodded to herself. "Just before midnight, I should think. Perhaps 11:45. I remember looking at the kitchen clock after I saw him, and it was 5 minutes to 12. "Can you describe him?" Crayock asked, his voice low. Mrs. Merton shook her head. "It was too dark, and he was some distance away. Tall, I think, wearing dark clothes. That's all I can say with certainty." "Did you see what he did?" "He seemed to pause by the gate as if he were listening. Then he opened it very carefully and quietly and slipped through. I watched for a moment, but then my milk began to boil over, and I had to attend to it. When I looked again, he was gone." "Why didn't you report this to the police?" Crayock asked. "I thought he might be visiting someone, or perhaps taking a shortcut. People use the lane sometimes, though they shouldn't. I never imagined—" She trailed off, looking horrified. "It was the body, wasn't it? The bundle he was carrying. Oh, dear God." Miss Marple reached over and patted her hand gently. "You were not to know. You've been most helpful by coming forward now." After Mrs. Merton had been gently escorted out by Constable Polk, Inspector Crayock turned to Miss Marple, a thoughtful expression on his face. "So, someone brought the body to your garden around midnight. That fits with the doctor's estimated time of death. The victim was already dead by then, which means he was killed elsewhere and transported here." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Exactly. The question now is why? Why my garden specifically?" "I've been thinking about that," Crayock said, scratching his chin. "It could be a simple case of convenience, a remote location to dispose of the body. But if that were the case, why would someone take the risk of bringing the body so far? And why leave it so carefully arranged? It doesn't make sense." Miss Marple paused, considering the inspector's words. "You're right. The careful placement of the body. It wasn't haphazard. Whoever did this knew exactly where they were going. Someone with a reason to have the body found, but not immediately, and not in a way that could lead back to them. And as you say, the location raises too many questions." Crayock stood up, walking slowly around the room as he thought. "The coat," he said suddenly. "You mentioned the coat that was left on the bench. That's another odd detail. Why leave it behind? Why not take it with the body? Whoever placed the body clearly wanted to leave something for us to find. It's a breadcrumb trail, but one that only someone familiar with your garden, and with you, would think to leave." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's almost as though someone wanted me to investigate. They knew I would find it." Crayock gave her a wry look. "You've certainly earned your reputation, Miss Marple." Miss Marple turned to the window, her thoughts still swirling. "The more I think about it, Inspector, the more I believe this wasn't just a random crime. Someone is trying to tell us something, and I have a sinking feeling that I'm not the only one who's being watched." The next morning, the investigation began to take on a more urgent tone. Inspector Crayock, clearly aware that Miss Marple's sharp eye had already uncovered several important clues, focused his efforts on the details that seemed to elude others. He and Constable Polk spent the morning retracing the steps of the man who had been found dead among the roses, examining the hedges, the garden, and the surrounding area with new focus. Miss Marple, meanwhile, spent much of the day quietly observing. She sat in her drawing room, watching the comings and goings of the police and pondering the details that still didn't fit. She felt a nagging sense of unease, like a loose thread in a well-worn sweater that refused to be ignored. At precisely 3 p.m., Constable Polk arrived back at her cottage with a grim expression. He carried a bundle of papers in his hand, which he handed to Miss Marple as soon as she opened the door. "We've got the results from the autopsy, Miss Marple," he said. "The victim's name was Edmund Darley. He worked in the shipping industry, a wealthy man. His body was moved sometime after midnight, but he died of a blow to the head. A blunt instrument, most likely." Miss Marple took the papers and skimmed through them, her brow furrowing as she read. "A blow to the head," she murmured. "It makes sense. A quick, decisive death." "And there's more, Miss Marple," Polk continued. "The man's clothing, good quality, expensive. But no identification except for a theatre ticket stub we found in his coat pocket. The Apollo Theatre in London. Last Thursday." Miss Marple set the papers down on the table, her mind turning the details over. "That's an interesting piece of information. Why would a man come all the way to St. Mary Me from London, especially considering the state of his clothing? It was quite deliberate. Not a quick trip, but one planned with care. Someone was trying to send a message." "You think it was deliberate, don't you?" Polk asked, taking a step closer. "That the body was placed here on purpose?" "I do," Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing. "It wasn't just about getting rid of the body. It was about the message and the coat. Someone wanted to make sure I found it. Someone who knows about my reputation for noticing details others miss." The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Miss Marple glanced toward the door, already knowing who it would be. She walked to the door and opened it to find Inspector Crayock standing there, his face drawn and weary. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." "Come in, Inspector," Miss Marple said, stepping aside to allow him entry. "I've just been reviewing some of the details. You look as though you've been busy." "We have been," Crayock said, his voice low. "The victim's identity has been confirmed. Edmund Darley, age 46, from Eaton Square, Belgravia. His family reported him missing this morning. It seems he went out on Sunday night and never came home. But here's the part that interests me, Miss Marple." He placed a photograph on the table. It was a crisp image of a man in his late 40s, well-dressed, with a neat mustache and an air of authority. "We've learned that he had connections with the Daltons." "The Daltons?" Miss Marple asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Crayock confirmed. "Lydia Dalton. His affair with her was widely known in London circles. The trouble is, we can't piece together how all of this connects to St. Mary Me." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her thoughts running in multiple directions. "We know Edmund Darley was in London Thursday night. A theatre ticket was found on him, and yet he ended up here in St. Mary Me, dead in my garden. The timing doesn't quite add up." "You're right," Crayock said. "And there's more. We've spoken to Mrs. Merton, who reported seeing a man carrying a heavy bundle late Sunday night. The timing lines up with the doctor's estimate of death, between 10 and 2 sang, though we still don't know where the murder actually took place." Miss Marple considered this. "The murder was not random, Inspector. This man was brought here with a purpose. But why St. Mary Me? Why my garden?" "I have an idea," Crayock said, his voice tight with resolve. "The Daltons have a townhouse in London, but no known connections to St. Mary Me. Could it be that this affair was the catalyst for something much larger? Revenge, maybe?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Revenge? That doesn't explain the careful placement of the body or the coat being left behind. Whoever did this wanted me to investigate. They wanted me to find the body, but they also wanted to make sure I followed the clues back to the Daltons." Crayock stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "Are you suggesting that the Daltons are somehow involved?" "It's quite possible," Miss Marple replied, her voice measured. "But I'm not so sure it's as simple as a jealous husband. There's something more at play here. The clues are being left intentionally, and I suspect they've been left for someone who knows how to look for them." Crayock looked at her, a sense of realization dawning. You think the killer wanted us to think it was the Daltons, but it's not them. It's someone else. Exactly, Miss Marple said softly, her eyes focused on the photograph of Edmund Darley. Someone who knows how to manipulate the situation. Someone who wanted the investigation to point in the right direction without actually leaving any trace of themselves behind. The inspector sighed, running a hand through his hair. We're getting closer, but we need more. What's the next step? Miss Marple smiled faintly. We need to see who would benefit from this murder, and we need to follow the scent, wherever it leads. The following morning, Miss Marple's thoughts continued to churn, each new detail she uncovered leading to more questions. Despite the clarity of her reasoning, there was an unsettling sense that they were missing something crucial, something hidden in plain sight. She took a walk around her garden, observing the roses once again, and was reminded of how gardens, like people, could be deceivingly simple on the surface, yet full of complexities beneath. She returned to her drawing room just as Inspector Crayock was entering. His face was still tense, but there was a determined look in his eyes. Miss Marple, he began without preamble, I've just come from London. We've traced Edmund Darley's movements the night he died. He was seen dining alone at his club and left around 9 p.m. There was a telephone call made to him just before he left, which seems to have shaken him up. And then what? Miss Marple asked, leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the inspector. We can't be sure where he went after that, but we know that he was killed sometime between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. His body was found in your garden, and the murder appears to have been carefully planned. But Miss Marple, here's the part that intrigues me. His body wasn't simply dumped here, it was brought to you specifically. Exactly, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but sharp. Someone wanted it to be found by me, someone who knows my methods. They knew I would notice the details, like the roses, untouched. The man was placed there deliberately. I believe we are looking for someone who knows this village well, or at least knows enough to take the calculated risk of bringing a body here. Crayock paused, his brow furrowing. You're right. Whoever did this had a plan. And it's not just about the body, is it? It's about sending a message, a careful, deliberate message. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and I suspect the message is directed at more than just the police. It's aimed at me. She stood up and walked over to the window, her mind racing. The more I think about it, the more convinced I am that Edmund Darley was murdered because of his connections, his involvement with the Daltons. But it's not just Lydia Dalton or her husband who might be involved. There's another player here, someone who would benefit from Darley's death. Crayock looked at her, sensing she was onto something important. Who? Miss Marple turned back toward him, her eyes glinting with insight. The theatre ticket stub found on Darley's body, the Apollo Theatre in London. If he was there last Thursday, he wasn't just attending any performance. It's possible he met someone there, someone who knew about his relationship with Lydia and had a vested interest in his silence. That someone could be our killer. Crayock's eyes widened. You think the killer is someone connected to the theatre? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not just connected to the theatre, Inspector. Connected to the people who might be hiding secrets. Someone who's been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. As Miss Marple spoke, Constable Polk arrived, bringing with him a new batch of information. Miss Marple, Inspector, I've just come from the local post office, he said, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. I've been looking into the visitor's log from the Copper Kettle Cafe. Mrs. Finch, the proprietor, mentioned a woman who came in yesterday, asking about Miss Marple's house. Crayock and Miss Marple exchanged a knowing glance. Lydia Dalton, Miss Marple said quietly, has been to St. Mary Mead, and if she knew about the body being moved, she may be the link between the killer and the murder. But we know that Mrs. Dalton was at the cafe just yesterday afternoon, Constable Polk added, glancing at his notes. And Mrs. Finch said the woman was asking about the house, about Miss Marple specifically. It could be Mrs. Dalton, but we can't be sure." "We don't need to be sure just yet," Miss Marple replied. "What we need is to track down every lead. The theater, the cafe, the connections. There's a pattern here. The woman asking about me, she knew that the case would be investigated. She wanted to ensure that I was involved, to make sure I would ask the right questions." Crayock's voice was low and tense. "And what if she's already gone? What if she's left the village?" Miss Marple walked over to the table, where the photograph of Edmund Darley still lay. Her finger traced the edges of the image. "Then we will find her. She's already made a mistake by leaving so many traces. The coat, the cufflink, the letter. Someone has been playing a game, Inspector. But every game has its rules, and every rule has a crack. We just need to find it." As the afternoon sun began to fade, the quiet of St. Mary Me seemed to settle over the town like a heavy blanket. Miss Marple sat in her drawing room, the faint sounds of the village outside drifting through her open window, but her mind was a whirl of activity. She paced the room thoughtfully, considering every conversation, every small detail she had observed. Inspector Crayock and Constable Polk were at the Copper Kettle, following up on Miss Marple's theory about Lydia Dalton. Meanwhile, Miss Marple was left to wrestle with the clues in her own mind, knowing that the answer lay somewhere between the lines of the evidence they had gathered. She stopped by the window, her gaze resting on her garden, now eerily still in the fading light. It was hard to imagine that just the day before, it had been the scene of such chaos. A body among the roses, carefully placed as though the killer had wanted to send a message. But what was the message? And to whom? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. "Miss Marple." It was Constable Polk, his face slightly flushed from the cold. "Come in, Constable," Miss Marple said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "Inspector Crayock and I have been speaking to Mrs. Finch, the owner of the Copper Kettle," he began, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "And, well, we've confirmed something rather troubling." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Constable." "Mrs. Finch recalled the woman who asked about you. She was not just asking for directions, Miss Marple. She was asking about the layout of the house, the garden, the windows. She seemed familiar with your routine." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "Familiar with my routine?" "Yes," Constable Polk continued. "She mentioned the roses specifically, how well they bloom in winter, the exact kind of detail you might expect from someone who's been to the garden before." Miss Marple's mind raced. Lydia Dalton had been to her garden, but why? And why leave such a trail of breadcrumbs? Had she truly come to visit, or had it been part of a larger plan to involve Miss Marple in the investigation? "And there's more," Constable Polk said, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Finch told us the woman ordered tea but seemed in a hurry. She kept checking her watch as if she were waiting for someone." "A woman in a hurry," Miss Marple mused, her voice soft. "I've seen that look before, but the question remains, Constable, who was she waiting for?" Before Constable Polk could respond, the door opened again, and Inspector Crayock entered, his brow furrowed with concern. "Miss Marple, Constable Polk, we've made an unsettling discovery," he said, holding up a thick envelope. "We've traced the theater ticket stub that was found on Edmund Darley's body. It was for a show at the Apollo Theatre in London last Thursday. The performance was sold out, but the ticket was purchased under the name of a man we now know to be a business associate of Mr. Darley, an industrialist named Reginald Ashford." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Ashford? And what does he have to do with this?" "Ashford is one of Geoffrey Dalton's closest allies," Crayock replied, his voice tight. "He was at the theatre on the same night as Darley. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Ashford is heavily involved in the steel industry. His company has been in a fierce battle with Dalton's firm for market control. If there was any motive to remove Darley, it could very well be tied to business interests." "Business interests?" Miss Marple's voice was sharp. "Are you suggesting that this was all about business rivalry?" Crayock nodded. It's a possibility we can't ignore. But there's another detail. Reginald Ashford's wife is none other than Lydia Dalton's childhood friend. Miss Marple's eyes widened. A childhood friend. How fascinating. Indeed, it seems that Ashford's wife was well aware of Lydia's affair with Edmund Darley. And if there was one thing Lydia Dalton feared most, it was the scandal that would ruin her reputation. If Ashford knew about the affair, or worse, if he used it against her, then it's conceivable that Lydia would do anything to protect herself, even going so far as to arrange for Darley's death. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly on the arm of her chair. But if Lydia Dalton was involved, why all the secrecy? Why the careful placement of the body, the coat, the clues left for me to find? Inspector Crayock's face darkened. That's the part we don't understand. We've found evidence suggesting that Mrs. Dalton wasn't the only one involved. Someone else orchestrated this. Someone who knew how to manipulate the situation. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It's clear now. Mrs. Dalton may have been part of the puzzle, but there's a larger web of deception here. One that involves business rivalry, personal connections, and perhaps a good deal of blackmail. Crayock took a deep breath. It's all starting to come together. But Miss Marple, there's one more thing. Reginald Ashford has a villa in the countryside. We're planning to search it, but it's possible he's already fled. If he's behind this, we'll need proof. Miss Marple stood up, a sense of purpose settling over her. Inspector, I think the time has come to visit the Ashford villa. We have enough pieces now to put the puzzle together. We just need to make sure we're looking in the right place. Inspector Crayock and Constable Polk were already gathering their things, preparing for the trip to Reginald Ashford's villa. Miss Marple, however, remained in her drawing room for a moment longer, reflecting on the complex web of motives and connections that had brought her to this point. The rain had stopped, and the village was unusually quiet. The only sounds were the distant murmur of the river and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Miss Marple couldn't help but think that, despite all her years of experience, there was something about this case that felt different, more dangerous, more deliberate. After a few moments, she stood up, straightening her cardigan, and made her way to the door. Constable Polk was waiting for her, his expression polite but expectant. "Shall we go, Miss Marple?" he asked, holding the door open for her. "Yes, Constable," she replied, her voice steady. "Let's see what we can find at Ashford's villa." The journey to the villa took them about an hour, the winding roads of the countryside growing more isolated with each mile. As they neared the estate, Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the imposing gates and the tall stone walls that encircled the property. The villa, a sprawling structure of ivy-covered stone, loomed in the distance, a fortress of secrets. When they arrived, Inspector Crayock wasted no time. He instructed Constable Polk to knock on the door and alert the villa's staff that they were there, while he stood back, eyeing the property with a practiced gaze. Miss Marple, ever observant, walked around the perimeter of the estate, noting the layout and the lack of any obvious signs of intrusion. It was clear the villa had been designed for privacy, and, perhaps, for keeping certain things hidden. Constable Polk soon returned, his face tight with worry. "No one's answering the door, sir. The housekeeper says she hasn't seen Mr. Ashford since yesterday afternoon." Crayock's lips pressed into a thin line. "We can't afford to waste any more time. Let's see what's inside." Miss Marple followed them as they entered through the servants' entrance, the air inside cool and musty, filled with the scent of aged wood and dust. The hallway was grand, with ornate tapestries hanging on the walls, each depicting scenes of ancient battles and noble hunts. They moved quickly through the villa, Crayock leading the way as Constable Polk checked rooms along the corridor. Finally, they came to a large study at the back of the house, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was a mix of clutter and elegance, a massive oak desk piled high with papers, bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, and windows that overlooked the meticulously kept gardens. Crayock wasted no time. He walked to the desk and began rifling through the papers. "We need something concrete, Miss Marple. Any sign that Ashford was involved with Darley's death?" Miss Marple observed the scene carefully, her sharp eyes catching the smallest of details. She walked over to the bookshelf and ran her fingers over the spines of the books. Then, her gaze stopped on a piece of paper tucked haphazardly between two volumes. "I believe I've found something," she said quietly, pulling the paper free. It was a letter, written in an elegant hand, but with a hurried scrawl at the bottom, as though the writer had been in a rush. Miss Marple scanned the contents of the letter quickly. It was addressed to R.A. from E.D., Edmund Darley. The letter read, "Reginald, I understand the pressure you're under with the board, but I can't continue to be a part of this. If you're willing to let me go, I'll sign the agreement, but I won't stay silent any longer about what I know. The truth will come out sooner or later, and you know as well as I do that the longer we delay, the harder it will be to cover up. If you truly want this to remain between us, you know what you have to do. Don't make me regret this decision. E.D." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her mind working swiftly. "This is it, Inspector. This letter is the key." Crayock stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Darley was threatening Ashford. This letter, it's blackmail, or at least it reads that way. He was going to expose something Ashford didn't want anyone to know. "And that," Miss Marple said softly, "is why Ashford killed him. But it doesn't explain why he would move the body to St. Mary Me and why he would involve Lydia Dalton in this." Crayock's eyes flickered with realization. "You think Lydia Dalton knew about the blackmail?" "I think she knew more than she let on," Miss Marple replied. "She wasn't just protecting her reputation. She was involved, yes, but in a much more subtle way than we first thought. She knew exactly who to go to when Edmund was murdered, and that's why she made sure the investigation went the way it did." Crayock clenched his jaw. Ashford used Darley to get rid of the one obstacle in his way, his business rival. But Lydia Dalton, she didn't want to be exposed for her affair with Darley. She had her own reasons for keeping the truth buried. As they continued to search the study, Miss Marple's mind was already racing ahead. Lydia knew how to manipulate the situation. She brought Darley's coat to St. Mary Me, hoping to implicate someone else, perhaps her husband or even Ashford himself. She thought by distancing herself from the crime, she could protect herself. Crayock paced around the room, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "But she didn't count on you noticing all the small details, Miss Marple." "It's not just the details," Miss Marple said, turning back to the letter in her hands. "It's the bigger picture. Darley knew too much about Ashford's dealings, and Lydia Dalton knew enough about the scandal to use it to her advantage. But what she didn't realize was that Ashford had already planned his escape route." The silence in the study deepened as the inspector and Miss Marple exchanged knowing looks. They were close now. They had the motive, the letters, and the knowledge of who was involved. It was only a matter of time before Ashford would have to answer for his actions. "We need to move quickly," Miss Marple said. "Ashford will not go down without a fight." Crayock nodded. "We'll need to get back to London. I'm arranging a team to arrest him." As Miss Marple left the villa with Crayock, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a final confrontation, a moment where all the secrets and lies would be revealed. And yet, as always, she couldn't help but wonder what small details she might have missed. After all, in her experience, no case was ever truly finished until every last clue had been uncovered. The drive back to London was quiet, the tension palpable in the air. The countryside outside was a blur of grey and green as the inspector's car sped along the winding roads, heading toward the heart of the city. Miss Marple sat in the back seat, her fingers lightly tapping against her handbag, her thoughts as sharp as ever, picking apart the final pieces of the puzzle. "We're nearly there, Miss Marple," Crayock said as he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. His voice carried the weight of the task ahead. "Do you think we have everything we need?" Miss Marple, her eyes focused on the road ahead, didn't respond immediately. She was still mulling over the implications of the letter from Edmund Darley and the calculated steps Lydia Dalton and Reginald Ashford had taken to cover their tracks. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but resolute. "We have most of it, Inspector, but there's still one part of the story that doesn't sit right with me." Crayock turned his head slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "The motive," she said, her gaze distant as if she were seeing the entire case unfold in her mind's eye. "Ashford may have killed Darley to silence him. That much is clear. But the question is, why go through all the trouble to involve Lydia Dalton? And why stage it in such a way that it pointed to her involvement?" Crayock frowned. "I see what you mean. It doesn't make sense that Lydia, despite the affair, would be so intricately involved in the murder. She's guilty of manipulating the situation, but she didn't plan the murder," Miss Marple finished for him. "She was a pawn in Ashford's game, but she thought she could use the situation to her advantage, perhaps to cover up the affair or to divert suspicion away from her own guilt." Crayock nodded, absorbing the nuance in her words. "And Ashford, he must have thought himself untouchable. He had the means, the resources, and the knowledge of the people involved. He orchestrated it all, right down to planting the body in your garden, Miss Marple." "That's right," Miss Marple said with a sigh, as though the entire weight of the case were finally settling on her. "But here's the thing that still puzzles me, Inspector. Ashford's attempt to frame Lydia, by involving her so deeply, wasn't about simply getting rid of Darley. It was about sending a message. He wanted to cover up his own involvement, yes, but he also wanted to make sure Lydia could never walk away from it." "You think Ashford wanted to use Lydia as a scapegoat?" Crayock asked, his voice growing more intense as the truth became clearer. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "But I believe he underestimated her. She might have been trapped in her marriage to Geoffrey Dalton, but she wasn't as naive as she appeared. Lydia knew she couldn't go to the authorities, but she also couldn't let Edmund Darley's death go unpunished. She wanted justice for him, and that's why she came to me. She knew I would see through the carefully constructed lies and find the truth." Crayock looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "You're right, Miss Marple. Lydia may have made mistakes, but she wasn't the mastermind. And Ashford, thinking he could cover his tracks, ended up leaving a trail too obvious to ignore." As the car entered the city, Miss Marple leaned back, a sense of quiet satisfaction filling her. The pieces were all there. They just needed to fit together in the right order. By the time they reached the police station, the team was already preparing for the arrest. Miss Marple and Inspector Crayock wasted no time, heading straight for Scotland Yard, where they were joined by the officers who had been investigating Reginald Ashford's background. "It's time," Crayock said as they approached the room where the team was gathered. "I agree," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "But remember, this isn't just about bringing Ashford to justice. It's about making sure the whole truth comes out. Lydia Dalton deserves that." Crayock nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We'll make sure of that." The plan was straightforward. Ashford would be arrested at his office, the one place he would likely be found, and Miss Marple would accompany them to witness the confrontation. She was, after all, the one who had pieced it all together. As they approached Ashford's office, Miss Marple felt the familiar tension that came before the resolution of a case. The feeling was both exhilarating and unnerving. This was the moment when everything would be revealed, when the carefully constructed web of lies would unravel and the truth would be exposed for all to see. They arrived at the office building, a sleek, modern structure in the heart of the city. As the team made their way inside, they were greeted by a receptionist who seemed strangely unaware of the impending storm. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes sharp as ever. "We need to speak with Mr. Reginald Ashford." The receptionist, a young woman with wide eyes, nodded quickly. "I'll let him know you're here, but I believe he's in a meeting. Would you like to wait?" "No," Crayock said firmly. We'll speak with him now." They made their way down a long corridor, the walls adorned with framed photographs and certificates. Ashford's office door stood at the end, a sleek, wood-paneled entrance that looked like it belonged to a man who valued his privacy. Crayock knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for a response. Inside, Reginald Ashford sat behind a large mahogany desk, his sharp eyes darting up in surprise as they entered. "Inspector Crayock," Ashford said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I think you know exactly why we're here, Mr. Ashford," Crayock replied, his voice hardening. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice cool and composed. "Reginald Ashford, you've been involved in the murder of Edmund Darley, and you attempted to frame Lydia Dalton for his death. We have the evidence to prove it." Ashford's face froze for a moment. Then the facade cracked, a flicker of panic flashing in his eyes before he regained his composure. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his tone forced. "This is a ridiculous accusation." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "It's not an accusation, Mr. Ashford. It's the truth. The letter from Darley, the theater ticket, the cufflink you left behind in my garden. It all leads back to you. You killed Edmund Darley to protect your business interests and silenced him, and then you used Lydia Dalton as a pawn to cover up your tracks." Ashford's face twisted with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I did what I had to do. Darley was a threat to everything I've worked for. He was blackmailing me, and I wasn't about to let him destroy my business. As for Lydia, she was never supposed to be involved, but she didn't know when to keep quiet." Crayock stepped forward, his voice low and stern. "It's over, Ashford. We have everything we need to put you away for good." The arrest was swift. As Ashford was led away, Miss Marple watched him with a mixture of pity and resolve. He had thought himself invincible, above reproach, but in the end, it was the smallest details, the ones he had overlooked, that had exposed him. When she and Crayock returned to her cottage later that evening, the air was filled with the quiet relief of a case well solved. The mystery was over. But as always, Miss Marple knew that another would come along soon enough. She poured herself a cup of tea, settling into her favorite chair by the window. The roses in the garden were still blooming, undisturbed by the events of the past few